You know, there's a reason we believe people when they cry witch. Not just back in 1692, but now, on the internet, in group chats, and in courtrooms. The words are different, but the fear is the same. And most terrifying of all, a lot of people who burn others at the stake think that they're doing the right thing. Hi, I'm Mallory, and this is This Again, the show where we dig into the past to make sense of the present and ask the question, why do we keep doing this? So let's rewind and let's get into it. In 1692, an 11-year-old girl named Anne Putnam Jr. stood in a Massachusetts courtroom and told the judges, quote, "She hath most grievously tormented me by biting, pinching, and almost choking me to death," end quote. That was accepted as evidence. The woman she accused would be dead within weeks. But here's the twist. The girl wasn't lying. Not exactly. She was scared. She was reacting. And most importantly, she was surrounded by adults who believed her. This is a story about Salem, but it's not just a story about witches. It's about belief, fear, and the terrifying shortcuts our brains take when we're trying to make sense of a chaotic world. And to really understand how a town like Salem could collapse under mass hysteria, we actually need to go back further, another 200 years, to a moment where a book taught the world how to fear the people around them. Before TikTok witches and witchy vibes, candles at Target, and before the Crucible and Halloween costumes, the word witch was synonymous with danger. It meant disease, famine, death. And for more than 2 centuries, it meant a very specific thing, a woman whose existence threatens the stability of the world. Now, the concept of witches existed long before the printing press, but the real panic, that was sparked almost literally by one little book written in 1487 by a German inquisitor with a giant axe to grind. It was called the Malleus Maleficarum, Latin for the Hammer of Witches. Its author, Heinrich Kramer, had an obsession for rooting out evil, especially the kind he believed lurked in women. It wasn't just a book. It was a handbook, a manual, and it was a weapon. But to understand why it hit so hard, we need to zoom out. Europe in the late 1400s wasn't exactly a beacon of calm. The Black Death had ravaged the continent a century earlier, killing off somewhere between a third and a half of the population. Entire villages were erased, and survivors weren't just traumatized, they were looking for someone to blame. Add in political upheaval, crop failures, ongoing wars, and the church cracking down on heresy like it was an Olympic sport, and you've got a society that's paranoid, fragile, and deeply invested in moral certainty. People were terrified of invisible threats, disease, famine, eternal damnation, and they were looking for simple explanations. Someone must be causing this. Someone had to be working with the devil. Enter the Malleus Maleficarum. When Kramer wrote it, he wasn't inventing the fear of witches, but he did give that fear a structure. He gave it rules, and he gave it authority. The church wasn't entirely on board at first. In fact, the University of Cologne rejected the book as being way too intense. So what did Kramer do? He forged endorsements from church officials, slapped them on the front, and published it anyway. And it worked. Thanks to the printing press, the Malleus Maleficarum spread like wildfire. It was reprinted dozens of times, translated into multiple languages, and cited by witch hunting courts across Europe for over a century. By some accounts, it was the second best-selling book of its time, right after the Bible, which tells you a lot about the moment. So, what made it so dangerous? It wasn't just religious paranoia. This book taught people how to identify, accuse, interrogate, and punish suspected witches. It laid out detailed instructions on everything from identifying witch marks to convincing someone to confess, to explaining why women were more likely to be witches in the first place. Here's a direct quote. "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which in women is insatiable." Not exactly subtle. Kramer believed that women were spiritually and intellectually inferior, and more prone to make deals with the devil. And this wasn't fringe. His views were mainstream. Worse, they were presented as objective truth. The Malleus reframed the world's suffering, the plagues, the famines, the stillbirths, bad weather, as a result of intentional evil, not just random misfortune, and it offered a solution: root out the witches. What followed was a bloodbath. Between the late 1400s and the early 1700s, between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. Most of them were women. Many were poor, widowed, childless, or simply what they considered to be odd or an outcast in those days. And nearly all were accused by people who truly believed, that their crops had failed or their children had died because a neighbor cast a spell. Here's the real chilling part. There was a pattern here. Witch hunts didn't happen during times of peace. They surged during periods of instability. In war, in plague, in economic downturns, people were scared, and fear makes people desperate for an explanation. The Malleus Maleficarum gave them one. It offered a story that made sense. Bad things don't just happen. Someone made them happen. Someone must be blamed. And so they found someone. That's the legacy the Puritans brought with them when they crossed the Atlantic. They didn't invent the witch panic, they inherited it, refined it even. In fact, by the time the Salem witch trials began in 1692, European witch trials were already dying down. Germany, Scotland, and France had started questioning the logic of witchcraft trials. Imagine that. But in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the old fear still lived. And when fear meets isolation, religious extremism, and a whole lot of teenage girls, well, we'll get to that. But first, let's pause here, because everything that happens in Salem, every accusation, every trial, every confession, it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a specific psychological phenomenon, one that affects us just as much today as it did in 1692. It's not magic, and it's not religion. It's something way scarier. It's how our brain works. By the winter of 1692, the people of Salem, Massachusetts, were already afraid. There was a war happening, King William's War to be specific, and it was the North American offshoot of a larger European conflict, and it brought raids, famine, and waves of refugees from Maine down into the colony. These weren't strangers, they were fellow Puritans, fleeing homes that had been burned, neighbors who had been scalped, and families that had been slaughtered. They came south, desperate and broken, with stories of death and demonic cruelty on the frontier. Then came disease. Smallpox crept into Salem village that same winter, spreading among families already struggling to survive the harsh New England cold. On top of all that, the Puritan government was in chaos. Their royal charter had been revoked by the English crown, and they were living in a kind of political limbo. There was no legitimate governor, no stable rule of law, just angry, scared, hyper-religious community trying to hold it all together with prayer and paranoia. It was a Jesus take the wheel type of situation. And into that pressure cooker came a group of girls. The first to fall ill was Betty Paris, the 9-year-old girl and daughter of a Reverend Samuel Paris. She started having strange fits, screaming, contorting her body, making accusations that invisible forces were attacking her, and then her cousin Abigail Williams joined in. Then several other girls, and within weeks, a small group of children had become the center of a full-blown community crisis. Physicians were called, but they couldn't find a physical cause. One doctor famously declared the girls were under an evil hand. Translation, it must be witchcraft. And that was all it took. We like to believe we're rational beings, but under stress, the brain doesn't default to logic. It defaults to meaning, and it wants that meaning fast, especially in chaos. So when someone offers a simple explanation for complex suffering, our brains will reach for it like a lifeline. And that's where cognitive bias begins to creep in. Let's talk about a few of the biases that showed up in Salem, some of which you'll probably recognize in yourself. Confirmation bias. Once someone was suspected of being a witch, everything they did confirmed it. Bridget Bishop wore odd clothes and had been accused of witchcraft before. She must be a witch. Sarah Good muttered under her breath after being turned away by a neighbor. Clearly, she was casting a curse. Even a bad look, a dead animal, or a crop failure could be reinterpreted as proof once the suspicion existed. The brain loves consistency. It filters the world to support what it already believes. And in Salem, that meant the accused were guilty before they even spoke a word. Let's talk about authority bias. When ministers, magistrates, and judges took the girl seriously, the public followed. If they said it was real, then who are you to question it? In fact, questioning the trials or even expressing doubt was dangerous. People who defended the accused were sometimes accused themselves, so even if you had doubts, it was safer to stay quiet. There's a reason cults work. There's a reason conspiracy theories spread, and there's a reason a town full of otherwise sane people went along with this. Because if you trust the people in charge and those people are afraid, then you should be afraid too, right? Then there's anchoring bias. This one's subtle but powerful. The first piece of information we hear tends to set the tone for everything that comes after. So when the first girl said that they were being attacked by witches, that became the anchor. Even if other information contradicted it, that idea stayed lodged in the collective mind. All other data got filtered through it. Today, we call this jumping to conclusions, but in Salem, jumping to conclusions meant people died. And then there's groupthink. This is where fear really snowballs. In small, tight knit communities, especially isolated ones, there's enormous pressure to conform. Going against the majority doesn't just make you unpopular, it makes you suspicious. Imagine you're a teenage girl in Salem. Your friends are having fits, screaming about witches, adults are paying attention. You're scared, confused, and you start to feel strange too. Are you lying? Maybe. Are you suggestible? Definitely. But are you entirely making it up? Not necessarily. Psychologists today understand that groupthink can change your perception of reality. Once an idea takes hold, it becomes contagious. Add in hysteria, poor nutrition, and Puritan guilt, and it's not hard to imagine a child convincing herself that she really was being tormented by spirits. The last one we'll talk about is patternicity. This is the human tendency to see patterns where none actually exist. It's the same instinct that makes you think your phone is vibrating when it's not, or that three bad things in a row must mean something's cursed. In Salem, this turned into an entire worldview. One cow dies? That could be a coincidence. Two cows? That's bad luck. Three cows? That's a witch. That's the devil. We want to believe that the world makes sense, that there's order behind the suffering. But sometimes bad things happen for no reason at all, and that's just way harder to live with. So, as the accusations grew, the evidence only got shakier. Witnesses described spectral attacks, meaning the spirit of someone had hurt them in a dream or a vision. In most courtrooms, that would get you laughed out the door. In Salem, it got you hanged. One man, Giles Corey, refused to plead guilty or innocent. The court couldn't try him without a plea, so they tried to force one out of him by laying massive stones on his chest. For 2 days, he laid in agony. His only words? More weight. That's how committed he was to resisting a broken system. And what's haunting is it didn't matter. Even as people began to question the trials, even as doubts crept in, it was too late. The machine was already in motion. And when a belief that has that much emotional weight behind it, logic can't stop it. Not easily, at least. Eventually, the hysteria would burn itself out. But not before 19 people were hanged, one crushed, dozens jailed, and a stain left on American history that never quite fades. But before we leave Salem behind, there's one more question we need to answer. Why did people confess? Why did anyone admit to being a witch, especially if they weren't? That's where the psychology gets even darker. So, how does someone confess to a crime they didn't commit? That question haunted people even in 1692, because as strange as the accusations were, the confessions were even stranger. Grown women, respected midwives, churchgoers, mothers, stood in court and admitted to flying through the air, signing the devil's book, and consorting with demons. Some even named others, creating a twisted chain of accusations. Why? Well, let's look at the setup. When you were accused of witchcraft in Salem, there were no lawyers. There were no legal protection, so you were already presumed guilty. And sometimes the only way to save yourself from execution was to confess. It was kind of like taking a plea deal in today's terms. It was essentially a trap. If you denied it, you were hanged. If you confessed and repented, you lived, at least for a while. If you named others, you were considered cooperative, which bought you even more favor. So let's be clear. Some people confess because it was rational, a strategy for survival. Lie, live. But it wasn't always that calculated. Some people genuinely started to believe the accusations against them, and that's where things get psychologically terrifying. There's a concept in psychology called memory conformity. It happens when someone starts to doubt their own memory under pressure, especially when authority figures insist something happened. You may have heard of false memories. They're not just mistakes. They can be entire narratives created through repeated suggestion, through isolation and emotional manipulation. In modern day interrogations, this is how innocent people end up confessing to crimes that they didn't commit. There's pressure, confusion, repetition, sleep deprivation, and most importantly, the growing belief that maybe you did something without realizing it. This may sound ridiculous, but it's not. Studies by psychologist Elizabeth Loftus have shown just how easy it is to implant false memories, even traumatic ones. In controlled studies, participants remembered things like being lost in a mall as a child or being attacked by an animal, all events that never actually happened. Now, imagine that power combined with 1600s theology. You're told that witches don't always know they're witches, that the devil can trick you, that signs of witchcraft might include your dreams, your thoughts, and your guilt. It's not a huge leap from there to maybe I did do something. Maybe I just didn't know. Add in starvation, prison conditions, public shaming, and the constant threat of death, and you've got a recipe for a psychological collapse. Let's not forget the role of coercion either. The Puritan justice system believed it was doing God's work, saving souls. So, extracting a confession wasn't just about punishment, it was about redemption. Getting someone to admit guilt wasn't just a win in court, it was a win in heaven. It was a win for the big guy. That mindset justifies a lot of horrifying behavior. Some accused were held in stress positions. Some were denied food and water, some were kept in isolation, awaiting trial for months. In that environment, a confession becomes less about truth and more just about relief. Confessing doesn't always mean you believe. Sometimes it just means you want the nightmare to end. There's also the role of social contagion. When people unconsciously pick up emotions, behaviors, and beliefs of those around them, this is especially powerful in groups that are isolated under threat. Studies have shown that mass delusions can spread like viruses. There have been cases of entire classrooms breaking into uncontrollable laughter or fainting or vomiting, all without a physical cause. One schoolgirl laughed, then another, and then hundreds. The laughter went on for months, and no one could explain it. We'll unpack that strange little chapter in a future episode. Fear is contagious, and belief, especially the paranoid kind, spreads faster than logic. Okay, so back to Salem. Imagine you're in that courtroom. Everyone's watching, and you've been interrogated for hours. Someone you thought was your friend just named you as a co-conspirator. You feel dizzy. You haven't eaten in days. And a respected minister says, "Confess, and God will forgive you." That's not a moment of clarity. That's psychological collapse. And even if part of you knows it's not true, the other part wants to live, wants forgiveness, just wants relief. So you confess. There's one case that perfectly illustrates how distorted the truth became and how broken the system was. Rebecca Nurse was a 71-year-old grandmother. She was deaf, pious, and known for her kindness and devotion to her church. When she was accused, people were shocked. Some even testified on her behalf, but it didn't matter. The accusers doubled down. They claimed her specter was tormenting them. They cried and collapsed in court as if her spirit were choking them, and Rebecca held her ground. She denied everything and ultimately refused to confess. At first, she was actually found not guilty, but the courtroom erupted. The accusers wailed, and the judge asked the jury to reconsider, and they did. They actually changed the verdict. Rebecca Nurse was hanged on July 19th, 1692. Her final words? "I am as innocent as the child unborn." So, what do we do with all this? Well, here's where we need to look in the mirror because we are not as evolved as we'd like to think. Modern psychology has shown us that cognitive bias, social pressure, and emotional reasoning can still twist people's beliefs, especially when they feel threatened. And while we may not be putting people on trial for witchcraft anymore, we are still very good at convincing ourselves that someone deserves to be ruined based on a hunch, or a rumor, or a 15-second video clip with no context. We love a simple story, a villain, a scapegoat. We want to believe we'd never be the ones holding the pitchfork, though. But history and science would suggest otherwise. We like to think of Salem as a cautionary tale from a more primitive time, but the only thing primitive about it was the fashion. Everything else, still very much in play. The fear, the bias, the emotional reasoning dressed up as moral clarity. We just have better lighting now. Now, look, it would be very easy for me to keep this train rolling straight into the wow, we still really hate women station, but I won't go there today. But for now, I'm going to pull the emergency brake and take us in a slightly different direction. Because the truth is, witch trials never really stopped. They just changed platforms. And if you want proof, you don't need a metaphor. You just need to look at what happened in New York City in the spring of 1989. On April 19th, 1989, a 28-year-old white woman named Trisha Miley was found in Central Park, raped and beaten nearly to death. She had lost so much blood, her body temperature had dropped to 85 degrees. The case shocked the city and ignited a firestorm. New York was already on edge. Violent crime was surging. Racial tension was high, and the media was hungry for answers. And almost immediately, the police zeroed in on a group of Black and Latino teenage boys who had been in the park that night. Kevin Richardson, Antron McCrae, Yusuf Salam, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise. They were all between 14 and 16 years old. And what happened next should feel uncomfortably familiar if you've been paying attention to this episode. Each of the boys were brought in for questioning alone. They were held for between 14 and 30 hours. Some were without food, without sleep, without parents, without lawyers. They were told they could go home if they just admitted what happened. That the others had already confessed and that signing the statement was the only way out. Yusuf Salam said they would ask questions and you'd try to give them the answer they wanted to hear. Raymond Santana said they'd say, "You're going to go home if you just say you were there." Antron McCrae just sadly said he just wanted to go home. Eventually, they all gave confessions. They contradicted each other, and the details didn't match the crime scene, or the timeline, or even each other's stories, but the police had what they needed, right? They had confessions. And here's the thing, it isn't rare. According to the Innocence Project, 1 in 4 wrongful convictions overturned by DNA evidence involved a false confession. 1 in 4. Let that sink in. The media branded the boys as a wolf pack. They were accused of going wilding, a term no one had ever used before that night. Tabloids splashed their faces across front pages, and the narrative was locked in. A wealthy white woman had been brutally attacked. These boys had confessed, so the case was closed. Even Donald Trump jumped in, buying full-page newspaper ads calling for the return of the death penalty. The actual facts of the case? Those didn't matter. There was no DNA match, there were no witnesses who placed the boys at the scene, and there was no physical evidence at all. But the public wasn't looking for nuance. They were looking for witches. Every step of the way I was told, "You did it. Just say it. Sign here and you can go home." And I believed them. These were the words of Corey Wise, who, at just 16, was tried as an adult and spent over a decade in some of the country's most violent prisons. In court, the prosecution leaned entirely on the confessions. The boys recanted immediately, but it didn't matter at that point. Juries watched the tapes, edited and sanitized, and convicted them anyway. In Salem, they called it spectral evidence. In New York, it was taped confessions. Same principle, where the beliefs were greater than the facts. In 2002, more than a decade later, a man named Matthias Reyes, a convicted serial rapist and murderer, confessed to the crime. He was quoted saying, "I committed the rape. alone, and they had nothing to do with it. His DNA matched with semen found on the victim. The boy's DNA, which had never matched anything at the scene, had been rightfully excluded all along. Their convictions were vacated, and they were finally exonerated, but they had already served between 6 and 13 years in prison. They lost their youth, their reputations, and their safety. And still, even after the confession, even after the DNA evidence, some people refuse to believe they were innocent, because once a witch has been named, it's hard to let that go. So tell me, how different is that from Salem? In both cases, fear set the stage, belief filled in the blanks, confessions became gospel, doubt was seen as betrayal, and innocence, well, that was just an inconvenience. And here's the kicker. None of the people driving the case forward thought they were doing harm. Not the police, not the prosecutors, not the public, not even the people who called for their deaths. They all thought they were doing the right thing, just like Salem. Here's the most haunting part of Salem. No one thought they were the villain. The accusers believed they were saving the community. The judges believed they were doing God's work. Even the people who condemned their neighbors did it with clear consciences. And that should scare the hell out of us, because most of the damage in history, witch trials, inquisitions, genocides, crusades, wasn't done by people who knew they were wrong. It was done by people who thought they were right. People who needed to believe in their own certainty more than they needed to pause and ask, what if I'm wrong? And I think about that a lot. Like, what are we doing right now with total confidence that people 400 years from now will look back and say, how could they not see it? Because someone will, and they'll be right. And honestly, that terrifies me a little, because certainty can be comforting, but history reminds us it can also be dangerous. The Salem trials weren't about witches. The Central Park Five weren't about justice. They were about fear, pressure, and the human need to make chaos feel tidy, even if it meant ruining someone's life. The scariest part about a witch trial isn't the mob. It's the moment you become part of it, because it all feels so righteous. And we still love a villain, someone to blame, someone to burn. We just use hashtags now instead of torches, and we call it justice. But if we don't learn how to pause, how to question, how to doubt the stories we're so sure of, then we're not the heroes in this story either. We're just repeating it. Thanks for listening to This Again. I'm Mallory Faust. And if this episode made you think or made you uncomfortable, good. That's kind of the point. And before you go, make sure to subscribe and share this episode with someone who always thinks they're right. I'll see you next time.